Hi, my name's Cameron Miller, and this is Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. And this is a sermon or reflection on the readings for the fourth Sunday of Easter. So, as you know, if you have heard me before, I like to dig around in the context of the gospel reading to see if it offers us a good perspective or a different perspective from which to read and hear the stories we are otherwise asked to take at face value. So whether Mark, Luke, Matthew, or John, it's good to be, or in fact, in relationship to anything, it's good to be curious. But in the Gospels, it's good to be curious about when they were writing and why they were writing and to whom they were writing. And at the same time, realize that the answer to those questions are anything but absolute, and in every instance have a multitude of scholars, each declaring their own answer. So when I say what I'm about to say, and I go down the road that I'm about to travel, you know I'm not giving you a recipe that is a universally embraced as the one and only absolute recipe. There are other ways to read it, and other ways to interpret it, and other ways to understand it. This is merely the way I do. John, the author of the Gospel of John, did not know Jesus. That's not even controversial. John lived far away, very far away, actually, by the standards of that time and place, from where Jesus lived. That, too, is generally recognized. At best, John wrote 60 years and 300 miles away from anything to do with the life and the times of Jesus of Nazareth. That's not controversial either. Now, some scholars actually place him 80 years after the death of Jesus. Well, given all that distance, 300 miles in a non-technological society, and 60 to 80 years in a society where life expectancy isn't that long, how is it that John makes speeches for Jesus? More than the other three Gospels, John places long, involved, and often complex prayer, sermons, and theological images on the lips of Jesus. Now, that's just obvious to anybody who puts these Gospels side by side, because in John, Jesus' speeches are long. In those funky old Bible texts that put everything Jesus said into red, as if he actually said it that way, as actually quotes from Jesus, they're really long. So, if we get curious, then we want to know where John came up with these speeches and these prayers and these ideas. Now, I don't raise this or any other question in a hostile or suspicious way, although I used to feel kind of that way about John, the Gospel of John. Rather, I just wonder about him, about his imagination or dreams or whatever muse it was that delivered fully cooked speeches for a tender young messianic movement, not yet old enough to be called Christianity. So here's the skinny on John, of the Gospel of John, as far as I gathered it anyway, being a preacher more than a scholar and a poet more than a historian. John was not John at all, but several Johns. Some of those who study such things for a living think that the Gospel of John was written and edited by several people over time, and that what we read today as the Gospel of John has been sculpted by more than one hand. But those scholars and those writers or editors of John's Gospel had a place to begin. And some scholars who work with this Gospel believe that the corpus of it, the original body of the Gospel as it was inherited by the community and generations after, had a basic coherence to it, to which some other stuff got added. That's not an unusual process. Well, when this gospel began to be written, these scholars propose, it had essentially two purposes. The first purpose of the Gospel of John was to stand in opposition to the synagogue, meaning against the Jewish followers of Jesus, or other Jews who allowed them to be in the synagogue. So in other words, John was originally written as an argument against remaining as a reform movement within Judaism, and instead of becoming a church, which did not exist yet. So, church, not synagogue, might have been John's campaign theme and a major plank of his theological platform. Church, not synagogue. And then the second purpose of John's gospel was an argument against John the Baptist and John the Baptist movement. Because you see, John the Baptist was far more well known and popular in his day than Jesus was in his. At least we think so. In fact, there's still a small sect of John the Baptist followers called Mandaeans who speak a dialect of Aramaic and live primarily today in Iran, Iraq, and Syria, although many of them have been wiped out over the civil wars. But there are also 10,000 Mandaeans living in Australia, of all places. Both John and Jesus, you see, were executed by civil authority as treasonous revolutionaries, and so presumably they both had popular followings. But in the decades following their deaths, John the Baptist had the edge in carrying the popular imagination. So the Gospel of John takes considerable effort, as do the other Gospels, to subordinate the Baptist to Jesus. We might say that the Gospel of John was an evangelical tract to promote church over synagogue and Jesus over John the Baptist. So, with this understanding of where John's authors and editors were coming from, we can readily see what the Good Shepherd image is all about. Who is the Good Shepherd? Oh, it's Jesus, not John the Baptist. Jesus is the good one. Then John has Jesus say, I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also. Who are those other sheep? The followers of the Baptist, of course. Also, other members of the synagogue. So, Jesus says, there is one flock, or John has Jesus say, there is one flock and one shepherd. Now, from this point of view of the Gospel of John, those other guys have to be put out of business, those other guys being the synagogue and followers of John the Baptist. They have to be put out of business and brought into the fold, which is a kind of fundamental business consolidation strategy of beating the competition and then taking them over. Now, I don't fault John, the Gospel of John editors and authors and their friends, for seeing the world and religion as a dog-eat-dog enterprise, because we have been chewing on that human flaw for as far back as we can see. But it really does stick out like a sore thumb today. With the lunacy of Afghanistan and the United States, Israel and Palestine, India and Pakistan, Sri Lanka and Tamil, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Buddhists and Rohingyas in Myanmar, the sectarianism found in the Gospel of John seems stupid, ignorant, utterly antithetical to the core spiritual wisdom of Jesus, the teacher. So today, I want to raise up that tension that's always present every time we say, this is who we are and this is what we believe. So, how do we claim identity and participation in community without also drawing too hard a boundary between us and them? How do we make being Christian meaningful when the original arguments that constituted Christianity no longer shape what we believe? How do we allow our identity as Christian to feel good when it also creates an association with people who use that same identity to behave in ways we reject? How do we form a Christian identity that is meaningful and positive when we are pluralistic and embrace the value of other religions at the same time that we uphold our own? Now, I'm an Episcopal priest, but I'm a baptized Christian first and foremost. And before that, I'm an agent of God's love, a creation of the Creator of all that is, and so any human affiliations are thin by contrast to being a child of God. We live in 2021 on a planet we have come to see from the moon and beyond. We're not in John's world, persecuted for our affiliations and in a war of beliefs against competing religions, oppressed by a common enemy. From our postmodern perspective, do we really believe that God insists that there be one shepherd? Are we a people who define ourselves over against Muslim believers and Jewish believers and Buddhist believers? Are we a people who insists we are right and the others are all wrong? Or are we a people who can trust the voice of wisdom we hear within the Gospels while affirming that others hear a trustworthy voice within their own and different tradition? The shepherd I hear does not worry about being the only shepherd. And so I can accept that he has sheep in other folds that I know nothing about. It need not make us jealous or feel threatened that our siblings, our fellow creatures and adherents to other religions or no religion, are well loved just as we are well loved. That shouldn't be a threat. That shouldn't be a problem. The Good Shepherd, it seems to me, is the one who loves us all and releases us from the need for fierce memberships and affiliations that keep us at one another's throats. In 2021, the Good Shepherd, the good sheep for that matter, recognize that all flocks share one pasture and have no fear and no trepidation and no resistance to it. I know John didn't say it that way, but he never saw what the earth looks like from the moon either. Peace be with you.